All right. Well, Jonathan, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for your book and for being here for a conversation. We've been looking forward to this all summer. So glad to have you.
Thank you.
We were just saying, I don't think we've had a temple conversation on the podcast before. And I think one of the things that was so fascinating to me about your book is that even though the temple has been such a part of our life forever, so much of this felt like new information for me. And I think that's probably because we have this idea that it's not secret, but it's sacred. And so there's kind of this ambiguity around what's really okay to talk about. And so I think in an effort to be on the safe side, we just don't really talk about it. And so I loved this. This felt like it felt like the doors just opened wide, and there were so many things that I didn't know that I have been absorbing in your book. But I wanted to maybe just start right there and talk about two things. First of all, like, what were you looking at? Like, what resources are available for on a topic that is so sacred, and are things recorded that you have access to? But also, secondly, did you have parameters in mind for what you were willing to write about and research? Or are there things that you felt like were out of bounds?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So first of all, you're absolutely right that we have a culture of privacy or even secrecy surrounding the temple. And many of our people go to the temple the first time, having never been prepared at all. Now, I think thankfully, over time, that's becoming less and less common.
Yeah.
But it still happens. And so we are not only careful, but sometimes even cagey about how we talk about the temple. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, first of all, it's worth just stating outright that Latter-day Saints do promise, we use the term covenant in the temple, but it's really a promise, to keep certain aspects of the temple reserved to the temple, like within the temple. But it's only a small, tiny fraction of what happens there. And I think in an effort to, again, be sort of careful and to instill the whole temple with a sense of sacredness, church leaders in the past have really advised the saints to limit their discussions about the temple. That's changing. So in the last decade, we've seen a lot of really important developments. The church has put online images of temple garments and temple clothing. They published the covenants that we make in the temple, which previously had been something explicitly that we were told not to share. So I think that's worth stating outright. Now, as far as researching and writing about the temple goes, Latter-day Saints, because the temple is such an important part of Latter-day Saint lived religion and our theology, we naturally keep records about it. We write about it. We talk about it. And the church archives are replete with documents that describe people's experiences and thoughts about the temple. Now, the church history library, which is the major repository of Latter-day Saint records, and they have a policy of redacting material that is sacred, private, or confidential.
Okay.
And sacred is a category of records that relates to the temple. But what that means in practice is, over the last 15 years, the church has released, probably 60 million images of records, and they're continuing to do that every year. Collections that were in the past not available for public access have been made public, and sometimes with just like a word or two or a sentence that is redacted in the image.
Okay.
And on the one hand, that feels like censorship, but at the same time, how many religions are publishing millions of documents about their founding, right? This is an act of transparency that's really important. And if it's just a handful of words here or there, those words really aren't always important to what the document is saying about the temple. They just might reference an aspect of the veil or a temple ceremony that is particularly sensitive. And so by going into the records, I've been researching and writing for 2 decades now. It's quite easy to describe what Latter-day Saints have experienced, how they have thought about it, and how the church has negotiated those elements of privacy across time.
Yeah. I wonder if you wouldn't mind sort of like contextualizing the temple and temple worship for us, in Christian history or even in world history. Like as as an adult sort of like attended other church services, for instance, I've kind of been like, oh, you know what? Like, especially, if you're looking at Protestant services, like it's very similar in many ways to our sacrament meeting. Like there's a lot of similarity. The temple, on the other hand, seems to me at least, to be sort of like utterly unique. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind maybe just like, what is the project of the temple as it was originally conceived? Where did it come from? I think one way you put it in the book is that Joseph Smith was ritualizing biblical archetypes. So maybe just like talk about, whatever comes to mind, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot in that series of questions. So, and I think it's important to hit all of them, or at least most of them, which I'll try to do.
Yeah.
So first off, you're absolutely right that Latter-day Saints are familiar with our Sunday worship that is inherently similar to low church Protestantism. So ritual, as a thing, exists across all human societies and cultures. Humans ritualize actions that are not obviously productive, right? So factories repeat actions over and over, but it's not ritual because it has a specific purpose and meaning. But from the outside, when a priest pours water on a believer or immerses them, to the outsider, it's not completely obvious what's happening. It's not obvious that that person is being adopted into the family of Christ or is signaling that he is part of a redemptive covenant. Like, those are meanings that are ascribed to the action by the believer. So ritual as a concept is everywhere. Sometimes ritual is informal or unscripted. We have set sacramental prayers when we bless the Lord's Supper in our services, but we have extemporaneous prayer. And our sermons are informal. We wear business attire to church.
I think we wear church attire to business.
Yeah, maybe so. Maybe so. But if you head over to the Anglicans or the Catholics, you'll find a priest dressed in dalmatics, stoles, chasubles, these priestly vestments that you would not find at the corporate headquarters, right? There's a script where there might be a procession. There's call and response. There's set prayers people participate in. It's highly scripted, formal worship. And when Latter-day Saints go to the temple, they experience that sort of ritual. So not the informal ritual of our Sunday experience, but the formalized ritual that many Roman Catholics and Anglicans are familiar with on a weekly basis. And
is that the difference between high church and low church?
Yeah.
The ritual and scripts, or all of that?
That's kind of a simplified way of looking at it. Okay. Absolutely.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
And so, so that's an important thing that we need to recognize. And one of the reasons that when some of our people go to the temple, it can be alienating or disorienting because they're simply not familiar with that sort of high church worship. Yeah. Now, what is this? What are these formalized rituals doing? Is a really interesting question. And my argument is that Joseph Smith regularly identified these, what I call biblical archetypes, these biblical stories or ideas, and he ritualized them. So on the one hand, we can be familiar with that in our weekly Sunday services. Jesus Christ administered the Lord's Supper, and we do the same thing at the Lord's table with our priests blessing the bread and water. Now in the temple, the question is, well, what is he ritualizing, or what story are we enacting? And there's some obvious things and not so obvious things, but essential to the development of the temple, because I think a Latter-day Saints aren't necessarily familiar with the idea that the temple, many aspects of the temple were present from the beginning of the Restoration, from 1830 forward. We often just focus on what happened in Nauvoo, but one of the key narratives is that in the book of Revelation, now, look, the book of Revelation is filled with lots of problematic imagery that we don't necessarily want to recapitulate in our daily lives. Yeah. But at the opening, John of Patmos has a vision of the throne of God. It's surrounded by a concourse of what he calls kings and priests. They have been made white by the blood of Christ. Their clothing has been made white by the blood of Christ, and they're singing hymns to the Lamb. They're from every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And Joseph Smith sees this, and he concludes that it's not just kings and priests, but queens and priestesses. And then he creates or reveals a set of rituals to transform this group of human beings into this heavenly concourse of kings and queens, priests and priestesses. And so important part of the temple is that work that Joseph Smith introduced to the church.
So one of the things that I think everybody probably has heard a little bit of, and maybe it makes you uneasy or you're nervous to look into it, is this connection to Masonic ritual. And I would love for you to talk about it. It's kind of an uncomfortable truth. How did this happen? Why was there an overlap? And what does it have to do with creating queens and priestesses and kings and priests? And like, how did this end up in our temple?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. So first of all, I think in popular media, Freemasons are this sort of like weird, controlling group that is micromanaging world affairs in the most like nefarious versions. And that's all just kind of absurd.
Okay.
It's a fraternal organization that is dedicated to...
So men only.
Men only. Yes. Okay. At the time, largely men only. Okay. There's some variations of practice in different orders.
Okay.
But they're dedicated to the uplift of the human race. And now there is a persistent kind of mythology around Freemasonry that it's ancient, but it largely grew in the last several hundred years.
Oh, really? Okay.
Largely in the 1700s.
Okay.
And when you join the Freemasonic organization or the Brotherhood, there is a dramatic initiation. So this is kind of hard for folks that live in our age to imagine, but there was a time before electronic media, audio, video, technology. And so there is a dramatic presentation that presents the story of a man named Hiram Abiff. And he's sort of a conglomeration of several characters in the Bible. But in the narrative, he is the chief architect for Solomon's temple. Mm-hmm. And as Freemasons join and participate in this dramatic presentation, they eventually play the role of Hiram. And in the narrative, there are people that want to access the sort of positionality of the Masons, of the people that are constructing the temple, and learn about what they know. And so they try to extort that out of Hiram. He doesn't relent, and so they kill him. And it's sort of a tragic tale of fidelity. And Joseph Smith and other Latter-day Saints participated. They joined Masonry several months before the temple endowment, as we experience it, was first revealed. So it's uncontroversial that he was a participant. It's uncontroversial that he was a witness to these ceremonies. Now, as part of these initiation ceremonies, there was ceremonial clothing. They wore an apron that was white and it had some designs on it. There were hand clasps that signified their progression through the ceremony, and other kind of various trappings that were later incorporated, or there were analogs in Joseph Smith's revelation of the temple endowment. Okay. So that's the broad context. Now, how does that relate to what we experience in the temple? Well, the story is completely different, right? But it appears, what's quite certain is that Joseph Smith used that technology. And I think it's worth thinking about what ritual theorists call social technology. Mm-hmm. So it's a technology, this idea of a dramatic presentation. He used that technology to present what Latter-day Saints call the plan of salvation. So he used these ideas of ceremonial clothing that are also found in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So the temple robes that we have today are based on the temple clothing of the ancient priests in Israel, so that are outlined in the book of Leviticus. He incorporated the revelation found in the book of Abraham about the creation of the world. And then Latter-day Saints, instead of playing the part of this Hebrew Bible character, we play the role of Adam and Eve as everybody falls, and then progresses back to the presence of God. Perhaps another element that's worth noting is that Freemasons include covenants or promises of secrecy. We incorporated some elements of that, and they also included penalties for breaking those promises of secrecy, which the Latter-day Saint Temple Endowment included up until about 1990.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think I think there's a very common sort of like progression here, at least for like lay members of the church, where you start by maybe going to the temple, experiencing, okay, that was interesting, pretty different. And the at least sort of like superficial conception is that Joseph Smith restored this through pure revelation. You know, it just like came down straight from God. It was necessary. It's presented as, at least, you know, maybe to a simplistic understanding like mine, as a necessary step in its specifics to return to the presence of God, right? And so like it makes sense to put those two things together and say, all right, God told us what we need to do, we're going to do it. And then you hear something like this, like, oh, actually Joseph Smith was a Mason. You know, this has a lot of corollaries. It's not exactly the same, but like it seems like, you know, potentially parts of it were, you know, or it has all these similarities, but you don't want to believe that it was lifted from Masonry. You still want to believe that it's revealed. And so then you go down this line of thinking where it's like, oh, well, Freemasonry must be ancient, you know, and it goes traces back to Solomon's temple, and I'm okay with this because it was revealed anciently and now it's been restored. And then you hear that Freemasonry actually mostly emerged in the 18th century, and it's like, okay, so now I don't have that explanation anymore. This appears to have emerged just after Joseph Smith became familiar with Freemasonry, and so it's like, okay, actually, maybe I think this is where people get hung up. Maybe this is made up essentially, and Joseph Smith was just sort of like pulling from his context. And you hear similar criticisms about the Book of Mormon, right? Where he's just pulling from context. And so people like the faith in the original project that you had as like revealed starts to like crumble a little bit. Could you address somebody that's sort of like going down that path?
Spiraling.
Yeah, I think it's worth just taking a step back and focusing on like the whole picture instead of specific mechanics. So for example, when the endowment was first transferred to film, I think most everybody is perfectly comfortable with the idea that the endowment is now presented by video. When they first transferred it to film, they used a sequence from the film Fantasia, the creation from the film Fantasia. They got permission from the Disney studio to use it, and for a number of years it was used.
That's so interesting.
I love it.
Yeah. I do too.
But was the church plagiarizing Disney in the endowment? Is the endowment like made up because they used Disney film? And if they had started there, if that was the first iteration, would we still be having the same conversation? And I think because we're familiar with the production of these technologies like film, we're more comfortable with that sort of borrowing, if we want to even call it borrowing, but that's essentially what it is.
Yeah.
And then just more theoretically, I think there is and I've used this metaphor before, I think there is a tendency to focus on mechanisms versus purposes. So if you have a car and no one's seen it before, they haven't seen it run, but they look inside and they see what people are doing. One could argue that the purpose of a car is to push pedals and to spin wheels. But like, that's absurd. The purpose of the car is to transport, to take you somewhere. You could even go even more granular and say that the purpose of the car is to burn petroleum, right? Like, no, that's not what it's doing. And maybe other types of engines burn petroleum products. And of course, there's a developmental process in the development of cars, and there's borrowings, but ultimately, if we say, what is the purpose of the temple, or what's the purpose of the endowment, it's doing something very different than what Freemasonry is doing. And so
even though they both have pedals and wheels.
Yeah. And if you say, well, is the temple a restoration of anything? What does it do? Like, is that anciently? And sure, we talk about Christ telling his disciples that they need to be endowed with power from on high before they preach the gospel in every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. We talk about this kingdom of priests that John of Patmos saw. And so Joseph Smith is materializing that. He's making it real through the technology he has at hand.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think that's so helpful I think it's just something that we have to grapple with, and until we look at it, it's kind of there, but it's unacknowledged and maybe still affecting us some way. And I really appreciate your direct approach to that, like to this kind of uncomfortable question. And I think what it's made me, this is something I think I had to examine early on when I started becoming more familiar with church history. And that's just this big question, which is, do I believe in a God that reaching? And like, do I believe that this is about technicalities and precision and in checking a box so perfectly that God must reward me with some presents? Or do I believe in a God that will honor that we are humans with pure intention reaching for heaven? And I think that answer is yes. Like, I believe in a God that's that big. And so it's sort of like turn the temperature down a little bit. And I think I could be okay with something being imperfect, something being completely Masonic, but genuine in the sense that this is us reaching for God. And I think that we make it holy because it's coming from love, and that's true. So I think that fear can really distract from that intention and become a real stumbling block. And so I just appreciate that you were open to going there, to talking about it so not defensively.
Thanks.
But there was another thing that you write about that sort of laid the foundation for the rest of the book for me, and I would love for you to explain this to us, because it felt like a really powerful metaphor that I kept recalling throughout the book. And so I'll let you tell the story, but you talk about the street lamps around the temple in Seattle. And this was just like, I felt like I was just breathing like with less anxiousness about some of these uncomfortable history questions after you told this story about these kind of leftover relics that just lost their context and took on a life of their own. So could you tell us about the candy cane street lamps?
Yeah. So I live in Bellevue, Washington. And the Seattle temple is actually in Bellevue, Washington. It's the Bellevue Temple, folks. It's perhaps like the La Jolla Temple in outside
What is
San
the
Diego.
official name of the temple?
The Seattle Temple.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We can cut that. Don't worry.
Yeah, thank you. And I go to church right behind the temple. And it's the ward I grew up in when I was young. And when you get off the freeway, it's just off I-90, the Seattle Temple, and it's in this prominent place, as many of our temples are. Yeah. And when you take the exit ramp off I-90, you'll notice that the street lights along the off-ramp are striped red and white. And at either end of the off-ramp, they're the normal gray. And there's really no indication otherwise of why this is the case. And the careful observer, if you stop and like squint and look, you'll notice that on top of the street lamps are inactive, what look like bulbs, like that are facing up. Now, for those old timers that have been around a long time, there's not a lot of Old Bellevue left, but they will remember that when the Seattle Temple was first built, the steeple was actually much shorter than it is today. And at the base of Moroni was a red strobe light. And that's because there was a municipal airport just down the hill from it. And these red and white striped street lights are a remnant from that period. The thing is about 2 years after, or maybe even a year after the temple was constructed, the municipal airport was torn down, and where it stands now are businesses and hotels. So if you didn't live there at that time, you would have no context for that. We've raised the spire, we've taken out the strobe light, but these lights, these street lights, are still entirely functional. They do the job. When you're driving, and it gets dark early in the winters in Seattle, but when you're driving at night and you're coming off the freeway, those lights will, help you on your way off. And there's no real reason to take the money to replace them or repaint them. Now, I think there's a lot of people that today, if you were to ask, hey, why are those red and white? They would have no idea. Yeah. And I think there's a lot of elements to the temple that are like that, that for whatever reason we've moved on or changed or grew out of. And there are these sort of orphans or practices that are entirely functional. They still do the job, but there's really no longer an explanation for why they are the way they are. And because we largely don't talk about the temple, and because we experience it kind of acontextually, we just throw people in and say, figure it out. We're kind of left to our own devices about like, well, what does this mean? What do these red and white lights mean? But fortunately, because we are excellent record keepers, we can dig through the archives, and just like we do with every other historical project, we can do the work and find the context that explains what's going on.
Yeah. Are there examples off the top of your head that you would want to share?
I mean, like the Freemasonry piece is a perfect example of that. There's certain things we did or have done in the past that make sense in that context, but just didn't make sense anymore. Yeah. I think that's why they removed the penalties. They just didn't make sense. I think there's elements from temple clothing that if you don't know the connection to the priests in ancient Israel, they just like, what's going on? Okay. Right? Why are these robes of the holy priesthood designed the way they are? Is there a cap? Yeah. And when you look in the Bible, it's like, oh, it actually says there is a cap and a robe and a sash. Yeah. So there's elements like that that are pretty even available that aren't really hidden that much, that we just don't talk about that often.
Yeah. Yeah. That totally makes sense. I'm curious too, if there are examples where once you know the context, if it's more like the red and white streetlights where you're like, we could repaint them. We don't actually, they don't need to be this way. Like I could see, if you go back into the Bible and you see the sash and the hat and the apron, then that gives it some meaningful context. But are there any examples where it's just what we've got and it was connected to something before, and now we actually don't need to we don't need to fill it with meaning. It just is the tradition. Yeah, I think when we look at the changes, people that have been going to the temple for the last 10 years have experienced quite a number of changes. Yeah. And I think that was surprising for folks that hadn't perhaps lived. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of similar changes that were happening. But if you weren't that old, this was kind of new. Okay. And I think in every case, it's an example of
them saying, well, why not?
Yeah. Yep. That's a great point.
Yeah. And I think, didn't you share in the book, it was either a quote or a scripture or something about how these types of things should be unchanging? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe let's talk about that for a moment, because I think, as somebody that, grew up, I think I went to the temple about 10 years before maybe there were some more like consistent changes. And so I at least started, thinking that this was pretty constant, and also didn't have the historical context of other changes that had happened. And so I think that's another tricky point for some people. It's like, okay, we have some theology potentially that says these things shouldn't be changing, and now we're seeing them change. They were supposed to be eternal. Like, what's going on? How can this still be valid?
Yeah. And actually, for a long time, our institute manuals quoted Joseph Smith as saying, ordinance of the priesthood can't be changed.
Okay, that's
that's the one.
Wow. Okay.
They were set forth in the foundation of the world.
Yeah.
And then they would quote Isaiah to say, when you change, my ordinances, you've broken my covenants, and all is lost.
Yeah.
And so we our own people set the stakes really high for change, so that when change happened, there was a lot of folks that weren't prepared for it.
Yeah.
That was an own goal, essentially. But what's important about that phrase that Joseph Smith, that we share, that Joseph Smith said, is that it's largely based on a misreading. So we perpetuated this statement that he made in a sermon that was published in the History of the Church. It was a kind of a compilation of different sources that the editors put together. But we have the original notes that two apostles wrote when they listened to the sermon at the time. And this one is key. So Latter-day Saints use the term ordinances. And over time, we've developed a very particular meaning that is not shared with other Christians, and it's not shared with the early church. So
Our early church.
So when we say ordinances, what we mean is what other Christians say when they say sacraments. It's these set rituals that do like certain religious work. They convey grace according to the Protestant definition, or we would say they change the universe, really, and that are performed by priesthood officers, right? That's what an ordinance is. Well, so we're gonna have a quick history lesson here, okay? And I'm sorry for the divergence. We'll get there, I promise.
This is great.
Sacraments, so that's what Roman Catholics have. Protestants, some of them still believe in sacraments, but many of them were very uncomfortable with the idea that anything that we could do mattered, that we were only saved by faith, right? That was kind of a Protestant axiom among certain groups of Protestants. They're like, it doesn't matter, you can't do anything, you just have faith, and that's salvation. So things like baptism couldn't forgive sins. They couldn't convey grace. So what were they? They used the term ordinance, and in a legal sense. So we're perhaps familiar with the term a municipal ordinance. Joseph Smith helped draft the laws and ordinances of Nauvoo. So, and that's a legal doublet. It happens, you aid and abet, free and clear, breaking and entering, laws and ordinances. So ordinances are laws. And so when Joseph Smith, you can read the sermon is largely about baptism for the dead. So he's saying, look, the laws and ordinances of the gospel were set at the beginning, and they can't be changed. If one person is saved by baptism, everybody has to be saved by baptism, including the dead. And so the laws and ordinances of the gospel can't be altered or changed, but that doesn't necessarily mean how we baptize can't be changed. Right? So nobody in Joseph Smith's life was baptized wearing white. In fact, we used 5 different baptismal prayers in the 19th century, different baptismal prayers. This one sort of blows people's minds. We didn't use the sacrament prayers.
Really?
Like Joseph Smith probably never heard the sacrament prayer that we use every Sunday.
Wow.
They made it up every week. They extemporized.
Really?
Yeah, right? And it was fine for them. Like by the 1860s, we decided to formalize as a people that we're going to use the prayers in the Doctrine and Covenants in the Book of Mormon. But there's elements like of how we do things that are constantly changing. Joseph Smith wasn't saying, hey, there's this perfect ritual in heaven that if you don't follow, then it doesn't count.
Yeah.
He's not saying that. And you know what? Thank heaven.
Yeah.
Because not only is it absurd, but it's like neurotic.
Yeah.
What he's saying is that the laws, which is everybody needs to be baptized, everybody needs to have faith, everybody needs to repent, everybody needs to be baptized and receive the Holy Ghost. Those are the laws and ordinances of the gospel, the laws and ordinances
Wow.
of the gospel. And everybody needs those. Those can't be altered.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. Okay, so while we're in this world of early church history, when was the temple, the way we think about it, a thing? Like what were they doing in the first building that we started calling a temple? What was happening there? And what did they think the purpose was? Like how were they thinking about the purpose of that building?
Okay, so this is again a difficult question because the way we use terms has changed. So there's a temple in Kirtland. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints recently purchased it from the Community of Christ. And we typically call that today the Kirtland Temple.
Yeah.
At the time when it was being constructed, they largely called it the House of the Lord or the Stone Chapel or the Chapel House.
Was it separate from a different meeting house?
We didn't have meeting houses as a people.
So were they doing Sunday worship there?
Yeah,
with
totally.
Children and...
Yes and no. We didn't bring children to church until the 20th century, largely.
Oh, that would be easier.
Well, yes, moms often didn't come that many.
But that's why Cheerios were
okay.
But yeah, in fact, they didn't actively start. This is a digression. They didn't actively start encouraging people to bring their young children to church until the second half of the 20th century.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Really?
Sorry, digression.
Very interesting digression.
So back to the Kirtland Temple. So within the first year of the church, Joseph Smith had a revelation that said you need to move to Kirtland so that you can be endowed with power from on high. And that's recapitulating the language of Luke, Acts. Luke and Acts are 2 volumes of the same book. The resurrected Lord appeared to his disciples, hung out with them, and before he left, he says, you need to tarry here in Jerusalem until you're endowed with power from on high, at which point you need to preach the gospel. And so they need to move to Kirtland so they're endowed with power from on high. There's an early version of this endowment in 1831. But with subsequent revelation, the Lord declares that they need the ministers of the gospel need to be endowed in my house, the revelation says. So they build the house of the Lord. Joseph Smith reveals a new set of ceremonies. They start washing their bodies. Then they anoint with oil. They seal blessings on each other. And this is critical because, look, if I don't shower every day, I get uncomfortable. Like I have clean clothes every day. I have a washing machine, and I thank the Lord. To contrast that, in 1836, the winter bath hadn't been invented yet.
You're kidding.
So imagine not bathing for months. And what that would have been like physically and sensorially. Then imagine not having bathed for months and then washing in pure water and perfuming yourself with cinnamon infused alcohol and then being anointed and then going into the house of the Lord. So it's not just a change in physical space, but a change in physical embodiment. you're creating a new sense of sacred.
Yeah.
They go into the temple after it's dedicated and have a solemn assembly where they feast on the Lord's Supper, the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, day and night. They prophesy, they testify, and then they wash each other's feet, and there's an outpouring of spiritual power. And they call that, Joseph Smith, his scribe, writes in his diary that that experience will long be remembered as a great endowment. So that's the first endowment of power. Then in Nauvoo, so that's 1836, in Nauvoo, beginning in 1842, Joseph Smith reveals the pattern of endowment that kind of forms the basis of what we experience today. And that's that sort of dramatic liturgy where we tell a story and we each kind of participate in the story. Now, I think it's easy today to become passive consumers. We watch a lot of video in modern society. My kids are constantly on a screen. It's a constant battle. But we largely are passive participants. There's a propensity for that to happen in the temple as well. But in the early endowment, they everybody ate the fruit. So like there was much more participation. Like everybody sat at the altar, knelt at the altar, and made covenants there. Now it's we kind of participate by proxy.
Yeah. And at that point, was there a script, or was this something that was different every time?
So this is a difficult question because the historical records are lacking, and there's a new sense of privacy and sacredness in Nauvoo, where in Kirtland, there hadn't yet developed this sense of privacy around the house of the Lord. And so we have these rich and well-documented accounts about what happens. The liturgy is very descriptive. In Nauvoo, we start to see things like washed, anointed, sealed.
Okay.
Like that's the entire description.
Okay.
But what we do know is that we know when women are brought into the temple experience. We know that after Joseph Smith's death, when the temple's finally complete, the Quorum of the 12 worked to, so during Joseph Smith's life, a handful of people participate in the endowment. After the temple's complete, the Quorum of the 12 usher thousands through the Nauvoo temple. And as they're doing that, they're constantly systematizing how they do it and making it more regular. We know exactly when they added certain characters. So as part of the temple narrative, there are messengers from God. And we know exactly at what day Brigham Young added those characters to the story. And they talk about making sure that all the temple garments are the same, because there's a period when they're all different. And so, there's this sort of regularization that happens
in Joseph's lifetime,
largely when the temple's complete.
Okay.
So that's after Joseph Smith is dead, and they're starting to bring thousands through.
Okay.
Yeah. But still in Nauvoo, you're saying?
Yeah, still in Nauvoo.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about garments, when they were introduced, what the original purposes was, and sort of like what the original set of beliefs around them were?
Yeah. So this is, again, not always easy to reconstruct from the records that are available. But I think there's several narratives that we can say about the garment. So Latter-day Saints often talk about garments. These are religious underwear that they wear. They're white underwear. They are sort of like boxer briefs, white boxer briefs. They go kind of down to the knee, or if it's wintertime, down to your ankle if you prefer. And then a white t-shirt of varying sleeve length and collar cuts, right? So that's what garments are. And I think it's quite clear that in the Hebrew Bible, so in the Old Testament, when it's talking about the clothing of the priests that served at the temple in ancient Israel, they wore what the King James Version calls linen breeches to cover their nakedness before the Lord. So it's priestly underwear, right? And it was part of their priestly vestments. And so I think its first layer, that's what they functioned as in the temple. They're part of the priestly clothing of the temple. with time, I think the narrative is expanded to include we talk about, and this is something that church leaders have talked about in recent decades, is that they represent the coats of skin that Adam and Eve were given when they left the garden. I think there's some lovely imagery and narrative about that the first death in the world was kind of placed upon them as a protection, these coats of skin, as a sacrifice, perhaps. There's some interesting possible theology around that. But I think ultimately for me, the most powerful or useful narrative is the idea that it's the priestly clothing of the priests that served in Israel. And early on, it's quite clear that they did not wear their garment. They did not wear the garment at all times.
Okay.
After, I think most people are aware that when Joseph Smith was killed in Carthage, both he and Hiram and some of the others present were not wearing the garment. I think that's fairly common knowledge. It's talked about in saints. In the temple, when they were going through the temple, after his death, the temple's been completed. So this is several years later. Church leaders are fielding questions, and we have a journal entry where John Taylor, who's in Carthage, is sort of defensive. He's like, look, we did not take off our garments because we were scared.
Okay.
And one of the other church leaders was like, yeah, I talked to Joseph Smith before he was killed. He wasn't wearing his garments, and he said it was just too hot. Now, if you've ever been in the Midwest in a humid summer, you will appreciate Joseph Smith's sentiment. And I think for people that are also unaware, the garment at that time was patterned after kind of the Union suit or long underwear type of the period. So it went down to your ankles, went down to your wrists. And so, yeah, that would have been very hot. And I think that impulse that Joseph Smith had is also part of the impulse that has informed church leaders' recent decision to kind of remove the sleeve on the garment. And I think they've said quite clearly that it's in response to folks that live in the Southern Hemisphere where there's not a lot of air conditioning.
Yeah.
So I think that we can understand that impulse. It appears pretty quickly, I think, because the fact that church leaders were even talking about it in the temple, like fielding questions about their underwear, suggests that it's starting to become normative that you would wear it at all times. There is some examples of church leaders talking about putting on their garments to have prayer circles along the Trail West. But I think my reading of those sources suggests that they're conflating garment and temple robes.
Really?
They're
Because
talking
they were
about
doing that. So they were wearing temple clothes outside of the temple sometimes for these
absolutely.
For these rituals.
Yeah, so the prayer circles actually exist outside of the temple into like the late 1970s. So my stake center in Seattle or in Bellevue had an altar in it until 1979.
Whoa. Oh, that's very
Where
interesting.
people would wear their temple clothing?
Yeah,
and participate in prayer circles.
Yeah, it was for the Stake High Council.
Yeah.
But the Stake High Council would have a prayer circle there, and so it was common throughout the church to have what I call extra temple prayer circles. That's like a kind of a fancy way of saying prayer circles outside the temple.
Okay. Another thing that was really interesting to me that I wasn't very familiar with this history is just where the temple recommend interview concept comes from. And you bring up something about how it was common for churches, contemporary churches, to have some sort of token or ticket that you would to be able to take the sacrament or the Lord's Supper. And that was not something that Joseph Smith instigated, but it seems like that was more happening in these temple settings. Or do you think of that as a completely different
No, I think
thing?
I think it's how we regulate sacred space and access to the liturgies of the Christian church is important. And this is something that every denomination wrestles with to some extent or other. And now, Protestants were lot more fastidious in the 19th century than they are today, about knowing who has access to the Lord's Supper and who doesn't.
Really? There was like a worthiness bar.
Yeah, not everybody could access it. Like in Congregationalism, you had to, even if you were baptized as a kid, you could not access the Lord's Supper until you had you were convicted of your sin by the Holy Spirit, had personal regeneration, had a personal witness of Christ, confessed it before the church, became an official member, and then you could access the Lord's Supper. And so Protestants, like the Methodists and Presbyterians, would offer like these like bus tickets or tokens, right, to be able to access the Lord's Supper. Wow. And we didn't do that. I think I'm working on a project on the Lord's Supper right now that hopefully one day will be published with David Grua. And I think that it's pretty clear that for most of the 19th century, we had an open communion. Okay. That we let anybody participate and take the emblems of Christ. And that's important context, but it's also contrast to what Joseph Smith did with the temple and other Latter-day Saint leaders did subsequently. So we have the temple. It's being constructed by tithing, but also by tithing labor predominantly and donations. Nauvoo is, we talk about it rivaling Chicago in population, but it is dirt poor. There is no cash. And so it's largely a barter economy. And every household, every church member household was asked to donate 1 day of labor in 10 for the building of the Nauvoo temple. It was labor tithing that constructed the temple. And consequently, church leaders were like, look, you can access, because the font was finished first. Okay. And they started doing baptisms in the font. And they said, look, if you donated, you can have access. Okay.
And was that the only requirement?
To begin with. Okay. So you could go in, say, declare that you'd paid your tithing. They would give you a certificate. These are all over the Joseph Smith Papers website. This certifies that you get to go and have access to the temple font. So that was the first kind of example of regulating who accesses the temple. Okay. With time, once we get to Utah, we have the endowment house and the various temples, and it's sort of the bishop's job to know the members, and they would write a letter that says, I recommend this person to go to the temple. I vouch for him. That would get sent to the church president, who would have to sign it. Okay. That's unsustainable. Yeah. So eventually the stake presidents get involved, and we get a kind of a two-tiered thing. And then with time, we get kind of a set list of questions that we need to ask. And
presumably these are the things that bishops were considering when they wrote that letter.
Initially, church leaders just kind of preached, hey, you need to do these things if you're coming to the temple. And sometimes people got bent out of shape about who was let to go to the temple. Okay. Okay. Yeah, they didn't like it that brother so-and-so and sister so-and-so got temple recommends because the bishop vouched for them. Because communities are the way they are, I think there was a lot of leeway. Early on, they talked about living the word of wisdom. I mean, going back into the 1870s, but really, it doesn't look like it's a formal require for perfect abstinence until like the late 30s, early 1940s. Wow. So even though church leaders like, don't do it, you have to obey the word of wisdom if you want a temple recommend. If you had a little wine or a little beer, it wasn't a deal breaker. Yeah. If you got drunk, that's a different story.
Very interesting.
Okay.
I wonder if we could dive maybe a little bit, and this is less of a historical question, I guess, maybe more of a devotional question around this concept, the general concept of conditional participation. I remember last year, sometime, maybe a year and a half ago, we were at a weekend retreat with a bunch of people, and word got out that we were Latter-day Saints, And this guy, you know, a day in or so came up and talked to us. You could tell he'd been sort of like searching us out. And he's like, essentially he had a bone to pick with us, which is that he had gone multiple times to his best friend's children's weddings, which took place in the temple, and sat outside with his best friend as they essentially wept together, you know, and because this man no longer held a temple recommend. And he was so disturbed by this concept. Like, how could you possibly, you know, and he's sort of like putting this on us, you know, as the token Latter-day Saints there, you know, how could you possibly make my best friend sit outside as his daughter or his son is getting married? He's very emotional about it. Yeah. And obviously we had no satisfactory answers to give him.
I think especially because his point was like, he's the best guy I know.
Yes,
like
yes,
he's not
right.
going in there because he refuses to stretch the truth, and they're asking belief questions, and like he's searching and he's not sure, and like
he doesn't want to lie.
He's not going to lie, and he has reservations that are coming from this deep place of integrity, and he was just like he was truly just like, explain this to me, like explain to me how this guy isn't allowed to watch his daughter.
So now we're putting that question on you.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like from the outside, it's utterly baffling, right? Like he's not wrong. Like that's an entirely reasonable conclusion for him to make.
Yeah.
And look, it's personal for me. My grandma was a believer, like a deep and loving disciple of Christ. But she also didn't have a temple recommend for most of her life. And there's complicated reasons for that. She was twice widowed. There were people that judged her for some of the decisions she made that at the time in the early 20th century would have been entirely normal and practical today. She, as was common, look, in San Pete County, she drank coffee. And she stood outside the temple. I stayed with her, when my sister was married, because I was too young to go. And I hung out with my grandma. And at the time, I had no concept of how difficult that must have been. Yeah. In retrospect, my heavens. And so first of all, just a complete concurrence that is a really difficult situation. I think church leaders for a long time were not sensitive to how difficult that was. And we're so focused on encouraging people to be married in the temple that was so valuable. And it is, folks. This is the crowning sacrament of our faith. They were so intent on encouraging our people to go to the temple that they didn't want to acknowledge how difficult that could have been in certain situations. Mm-hmm. I think in recent years, especially during COVID, we had this change that church leaders said, look, it was actually before COVID. Yeah. They announced that you can get married civilly and not have any sort of waiting period. Yeah. And that many people's family situations would be blessed by having that sort of dual ceremony approach. And I think the church's overwhelming acceptance of that new policy demonstrates that it was, if not overdue, perfectly timed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know we've hit our time, but if I can, I'd really like to ask you about ceilings, because this was just another place where there have been so many changes that it felt like a lot. It felt like a lot of changes, and this is something that feels fixed in my mind. It feels like this is so central. Like, how could it be flexible? But it was just not that long ago that ceilings meant something really different, and that it's been redefined multiple times, actually, the intention behind ceilings. So could you just give us like a snapshot about the way that that's evolved into the ceilings that we understand now?
Yeah. So at least I think it's no secret that Latter-day Saints have had complex marriage arrangements.
Well, that's true.
But I think it's less well known that we used to seal people outside of biological relationships together, and we called it adoption. And also, we invested sealing with meaning that we might not necessarily carry on to the present. So I think today we recognize that human life is complicated, marriages are complicated, and divorce and remarriage is a reality that church leaders probably don't love, but recognize that it's probably the best choice in many situations. And so early on, church leaders micromanaged sealings. They wanted to be sure that everyone was going to be perfect because they invested sealings with the totality of the blessings of the church. If you read section 132, people that are sealed in marriage are sealed up into the material construction of heaven. It basically says that unless they commit the unpardonable sin, they're part of the sealed network of heaven. And again, this is not a way of talking about sealing that we are familiar with today. But over time, we realized that all these sorts of relationships that we were very fastidious in creating, whether it was a plural marriage or whether it was an adoption or it was a monogamous marriage that was divorced, and then we had a subsequent marriage, that each of those is likely contingent. And church leaders recognize that they're contingent on the faith of the participants. We recently heard from church leaders in the recent months that no sealing will be enforced in heaven for people that don't actually want to be together. And so I think there's kind of a relaxation of these strictures that have governed sealings for so long.
Yeah, I think that feels like the general arc also, but I guess I'm also still curious what was the root intention for sealings in the first place? Like, was there an intention to connect everyone? Was there an intention to just be sealed to God? Like, were we making chains? What was the point?
I think at least I'm old enough that I don't know what it was like for you growing up, but when we talked about what is the temple for, it's for eternal marriage. And we even showed a video. Like when I was a missionary, it was ensemble à jamais in French. I'm together forever. And it showed this like beautiful couple and their kids. And like, that's what the temple's for. And when you take a step back theologically and think, well, that's a small snapshot of what eternity looks like. I think it's quite clear that Joseph Smith was constructing that kingdom of priests, and that we talked about earlier, that kingdom of priests and priestesses, queens and kings, was constructed by sealing, these interpersonal sealings that built a network of belonging. And so heaven isn't a place that you get to go if you're good. It's not a reward if you're worthy of it. Heaven is something that is constructed at the altars of the temple. And when you left the temple, you took heaven with you. And if you're like me, you actively subvert it by your behavior and your ideas, right? But the sealed network is the ultimate goal. I think there's antecedents in the city of Zion, but ultimately, when John saw the concourse of heaven constructed of people from every nation and kindred and tongue, and people, every race, sealed together as the family of God, that's what Joseph Smith saw when he started sealing people together.
That's a beautiful vision.
Yeah, that idea of heaven is pretty revolutionary, actually. Well, Jonathan, I do we have to?
I think we do.
Okay. Well,
this is a strong plug to read the rest of the book.
Yeah, we need to. I actually wonder if maybe a part 2 at some point might be in order, because there's so much more to dive into here. But I want to thank you for this work. Like Aubrey said, it was really refreshing to approach this subject in an open but also respectful way. I think you did such a good job with it, and I learned so much, and this conversation's been amazing as well. So thank you so much.
That is deeply meaningful. Thank you both.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Jonathan Stapley. His new book, Holiness to the Lord, is coming out this fall, but you can pre-order it now. And if Faith Matters content is resonating with you and you get the chance, we would love for you to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews, and it really does help us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. You can also always reach out to us at info@faithmatters.org. Thanks again for listening.